Okay, so this time I'm going to watch this this crash course history video. I basically I saw that because years ago crash course they used to do like these world history videos, and I won't say they're as bad as like the cartoon history YouTubers. They at least have some standards, but I remember them even as a kid still being like relatively biased and stuff. So I saw a few days ago they started doing this like European history, and since I just reacted to one video on the Russian Revolution. I want to just give like a live sort of like I haven't watched this one yet. Just want to see, and this one is shorter, so I might be able to edit it and upload it quicker, and just see which one see how different the ideology is in this one compared to the old one.
History. So World War I unleashed seemingly endless violence, but while it was happening, even more violence was taking shape across Europe, most notably the Russian Revolution and Civil War. The failure of Tsar Nicholas II's government in directing the war effort caused immense suffering. He built no efficient administration to ensure adequate weaponry or transportation or food or medical care or the other necessities of modern warfare. I know we often like to make fun of bureaucracy, but governments without it tend to fail miserably.
So that's technically I guess that's true. Where like most people who learn about history and economics and stuff, they're generally told that bureaucracy is like a bad thing and like it's to be avoided. But like capitalism has bureaucrats too. They just don't call them bureaucrats. They call them like financial advisors and middle managers and things. Like if any form of societal organization needs accountability and responsibility and organization, that's what bureaucracy is. Just because the Soviet Union was state planning doesn't make their bureaucracy any better or worse than privately organized and privately accountable planning. It's all planning.
Russian soldiers were loyal and effective fighters, they suffered from a lack of basic materials, like bullets, for instance, and soldiers often went without boots, instead wearing rags on their feet. Some generals were first-rate, but others were totally uninstructed in modern techniques and more concerned with conducting pogroms against their own Jewish troops.
So that's another thing where I'm surprised that he acknowledges it. In the last video I did on the Russian Revolution, there was a point where I outlined in great detail how pogroms against Jews were like a very normal part of Tsarist Russian society, and Bolsheviks were the only power that was committed to stopping it, where they actually passed laws and used top-down central authority to make people stop doing pogroms against Jews because that was fucked up.
Then effectively fighting the enemy. As hundreds of thousands of wounded people and millions of refugees crossed back into an entirely unprepared Russia from 1915 on, soldiers deserted while civilian organizations picked up where the imperial administration failed. Local organizations called zemstvas took responsibility for civilian well-being, joining other groups to take care of the wounded and maintain the home front more generally. And throughout history, when people see such groups doing the work that governments traditionally do, it can deeply undermine support for governments. On the war front, the government wasn't much more inspirational.
That's also a very good point. We see the same thing happen in places like Palestine and Lebanon, where entities like Hamas and Hezbollah, they gain legitimacy on the ground because they're actually doing the work that like government on paper are supposed to do. Same thing in America with like the Black Panther Party feeding kids, doing community organizing and stuff like that. It's like the way power comes is from people having their trust in you that you're doing the right thing and not just like a piece of paper that says you have power. Which is why things like all parts of Soviets later on, they would say those things because the Soviets were the legitimate power in the people's eyes. It wasn't just like a random propaganda thing. It was like people expressing their genuine thoughts that they wanted legitimacy in the Soviets and not the provisional government's Duma.
After a string of Russian defeats, Tsar Nicholas decided that he should personally oversee the battlefront, which made him appear incompetent because, to be fair, he was, and also he seemed uninterested in the survival of ordinary Russians, which, again, you could make the case. All of this meant that a revolution was around the corner. But before we get there, I think the center of the world just opened. It's a calendar, and not just any calendar, it's our editorial director emeritus' vintage Katz calendar. So shortly, Russia would adapt this calendar, the one used in Europe and the United States. But at the time, it was still using a somewhat different calendar, which is why the International Women's Day we are about to talk about happened in Russian February and American March. Now, because the memorization calculation of dates is overrated. We are not going to overanalyze this, but for the record, everyone should use the exact same calendar all the time, specifically this vintage cat calendar. Okay, so on Russian February 23rd, 1917, it was International Women's Day. Working women took to the streets of Petrograd. Oh god, I feel another explanation coming on. Okay, Petrograd had been St. Petersburg, but that sounded too German, so they made it Petrograd, but soon it would be Leningrad, only eventually to become St. Petersburg again. Right, so it's February, sort of, and we're in Petrograd, sort of. The important thing is that these women were protesting the effects of a totally mismanaged war effort, soaring inflation, food scarcity, casualties in the millions, and an army often defeated and in retreat. Protests surged in the capital and then traveled the empire. Rebellious soldiers and the persistence of the angry crowds, along with the insistence of his wider family, eventually persuaded Nicholas to abdicate his throne. Members of the Duma, the
That is that's selling it very short, but I guess you can say that I guess if videos like this they would technically show them to like children in class, so I can understand why he wouldn't go too in depth on the nitty gritty, but yeah.
Assembly of Elected Representatives that Nicholas very reluctantly set up to end the revolution of 1905 constituted themselves as a provisional government consisting of monarchist, conservative, liberal, and a variety of socialist members. Both disorder and new forms of organization unfolded. Workers and soldiers revived the councils, or Soviets, they had used during the revolution of 1905 and began claiming a larger voice in ruling Russia, and as wealthy leaders of the provisional government and the less privileged members of the Soviets jostled for administrative supremacy, wartime chaos accelerated in Russian cities, especially in Petrograd, where soldiers and workers shot opponents, including random officials and military officers, because they stood for the oppression and starvation of the old regime. This competition for power on the home front coexisted with general support for World War I, which itself brought more death and more deprivation, which further...
It is, I would say, debatable that there was general support for World War One. I think by 1917, the idea that only the communists wanted World War One to end is very, very debatable. I don't think it's fair to say that given if you just acknowledge that the entire working class and peasantry was revolting because of the mismanagement of the war, I generally take issue with with the idea that like there was still general support for the war, because the thing is that that framing is very sympathetic to the post revolution justification for invading Soviet Russia to force the Bolshevik government to be removed from power and Russia uh, to be put back into World War One, because like the entire thing is like, oh, Russia was fighting Germany on the Eastern Front and was allowing the Western front to maintain the situation. If Germany defeats Russia on the East and then goes back and concentrates all their efforts on the West, that would not be ideal. So Russia continuing to be in the war was very convenient for the West, and the idea that the Russian people generally supported it. There's very few wars in history that like general ordinary people are fully supportive of, and World War II is like one of those notable exceptions. Vast majority of human history, most wars are for financial reasons that benefit the ruling class, not ordinary people. Ordinary people only stand to lose from wars most times.
weakened government and other institutions. Still, some were optimistic that life would change for the better, or as one poet put it, that our false, filthy, boring, hideous life should become a just, pure, merry, and beautiful life. Peasants confiscated some noble estates, while rank-and-file soldiers ended the degrading deference they had traditionally shown to aristocratic officers, and to some, equality and an expansion of rights felt imminent. In April 1917, the Germans organized Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin's passage from exile in Switzerland back to Russia. Bolsheviks, breaking with Marx's idea of the working class spearheading revolutionary change, believed that an elite cadre of leaders needed to lead the revolution. Once Lenin returned to Russia, he...
That's that's not really a fair way to describe what he's talking about. Vanguardism, the specific idea of Marxism, Leninism, that a vanguard of professional revolutions needs to, organize and lead the revolution. I think framing it like that is kind of like dishonest, because he's making them sound like SRs. He's making them sound like socialist revolutionaries who believe that like working class and peasant people didn't have revolutionary potential, that it was just them. Lenin didn't believe that only his Bolshevik friends should do the revolution. He believed that the revolution was disorganized and without a clear political line, without Bolsheviks as a vanguard, as an ideological vanguard. The movement was still in the name of the people, in the name of the workers and peasants, just like every other socialist revolution was, but a communist party filled with principled Marxists is how revolutions can be successful, according to Lenin. Not just like an elite, elite cadre of revolutionaries, however he describes it. It's like not fully inaccurate, but like, come on. Oh, damn.
Creation of a new Bolshevik society. Make the Bolshevik leaders. In April 19th, breaking with Marx's idea of the working class spearheading revolutionary change, believed that an elite cadre of leaders needed to lead the revolution. Once Lenin returned to Russia, he began making public revolutionary change, believed that an elite cadre.
By the way, look who it is. Look who it is. Look who it is. Look who it is. Look who isn't here.
Of leaders needed to lead the revolution. Once Lenin returned to Russia, he began making public speeches and declared a platform of peace, bread, land, an explicit rejection of continuing the war, and also the kind of populist slogan that deeply appealed to hungry, landless, and war-weary people.
I wonder why it appealed to them. It's almost like people were tired of war and wanted those things, because those things were popular ideas.
Lenin, along with another Bolshevik leader, Leon Trotsky, helped make the
I guess he was a Bolshevik leader, but like he joined Bolsheviks very late. He wasn't in that picture before. He joined the Bolsheviks like when it became clear that they were the dominant political force, or they were becoming the dominant political force.
Bolsheviks stand out with their publicity and grassroots organizing in factories and among soldiers, and the pair craftily altered their own positions as the wind blew, sometimes appearing to agree with the Soviets or certain provisional government positions, and at other times calling for violence and an end to the
He's showing a picture of the July days, but again, the July days were spontaneous. People were tired of all the ways that the provisional government was fucking up. He doesn't really acknowledge that the provisional government was fucking up. The Bolsheviks didn't organize the July days. The Bolsheviks distanced themselves from it, but the provisional government still uses it as an excuse to crack down on them, like you saw in the previous video. It wasn't that they organized violence because they wanted to opportunistically get rid of the provisional government. No. As we saw in the previous video, the Bolsheviks were getting more popular because people were starting to see all the ways where the provisional government was letting them down. They refused to end the war. They refused to enact land reforms. They refused to enact workers' rights. All of these things piled up. Yeah, the July days, they were violent protests, but the Bolsheviks didn't call for violence. They believed in violence, but they didn't organize the July days. They were just existing. They hadn't really, nothing had happened yet.
Democratic politics that most middle-of-the-roaders and other socialists wanted. For Lenin, it was violence alone that would bring about an overthrow of the old and the creation of a new Bolshevik society. Only
I mean, the way he says it, a new Bolshevik society, that's not really... Lenin just wanted the workers and peasants to be the dominant political actors, not the nobility, not the aristocracy, not the Russian Orthodox Church. He wanted peasants and workers to have a say, and they had a say in the Soviets. He wanted to create, maybe you could call it a Soviet society, but not a Bolshevik society. That just sounds weird. That's not really what Lenin wanted. I don't know.
Deliberately inflicted bloodshed would crush the aspirations for
The reason why Lenin believed that only violence would crush the old Tsarist authority was because they would never hand over power willingly. They could only be forced to relinquish it. No matter how much you peacefully protest, like we saw on Bloody Sunday, they will never peacefully give it up. That's why he believed in violence. He wasn't just like a violent dude. Like it was specific.
Democratic Russia. In the summer of 1917, a charismatic lawyer named Alexander Kerensky came to head the provisional government with the
A charismatic lawyer. Look at all the things that we learned about in the last video about Kerensky, and this he calls him a charismatic lawyer. That's so funny.
aim of reviving Russia's capacity to fight in World War I.
Why did he want to revive Russia's capacity to fight in World War One? Like we discussed in the previous video, because all of the landowning and wealthy classes and nobility and liberal reformers that were still invested in capitalism and that he primarily answered to, not the workers and peasants, wanted the war to continue because the war had financial upside. There was a potential for high profits from continuing the war. The workers and peasants wanted peace, land, and bread. The landowning classes, the nobility, the clergy, they wanted the war to continue. Look at whose needs he's responding to.
But the effort ultimately failed. The government, targeted by Bolshevik propaganda and organizing, had grown fatally weak.
Targeted by Bolshevik propaganda. I mean, yeah. The government was weak because people lost confidence in them. It's not like a magical thing. Propaganda can only work if it's true. Like, I mean, okay, that maybe some propaganda can work if it's false, but like, I mean, for a mass movement.
The thought bubble. By the fall, Lenin determined the time was right to overthrow the provisional government, and with it, the mixture of
Lenin had not determined the time was right by the fall. He completely ignores the fact that the after the July days, all the Bolshevik leaders were imprisoned, and Kerensky had put a super anti-communist, super anti-revolutionary general as the supreme commander of the entire country. And the first thing he tried to do was enact a coup to overthrow everything that the February Revolution had accomplished up until then. And Kerensky had to free the Bolshevik leaders so that they could defend the revolution. And that general then got put in jail. And while all this was happening, Lenin had to flee because after they started cracking down on Bolsheviks during the July days, Lenin had to be smuggled out of Russia and into Finland. So all of in between, like from the July days onwards, Lenin wasn't even in Russia. All the Kornilov stuff was happening while Lenin wasn't even there. It was the workers and peasants organized by Stalin, Trotsky, the rest of them, that had to defend the revolution. And it was only after the Kornilov affair had been dealt with that was when Lenin felt that he could come back. And it was at that point that Bolsheviks started gaining massive popularity. And that was when Lenin decided that it was time for the Bolsheviks to actually seize power like permanently and not risk themselves to constant, constant arrests and like crackdowns. And it was because Zinoviev and Kamenev started getting cold feet, like that video showed. It was because Zinoviev and Kamenev started getting cold feet and leaked the plans. That was when they decided that, okay, now they knew that we want to do it, let's actually do it. And by this point, because they had successfully defended the revolution, the workers and peasants were literally armed red guards that were invested in defending and preserving Soviet power. And they were not going to allow any efforts by the provisional governments to undermine Soviet power to be successful. It wasn't just like Lenin decided that time was right. These things had a reason for happening.
Democratic policies espoused by the hodgepodge of politicians, including various kinds of socialists and anarchists and constitutional monarchists, and liberals who sought rights and the rule of law. Lenin didn't believe the revolution could proceed via peaceful change or negotiation with all these various leaders. Instead, he insisted on the use of violence against them and rejected peaceful change or negotiation.
He didn't reject peaceful change or negotiation. That's a very liberal framing. Lenin rejected the preservation of bourgeois power. All those people that he just mentioned, all of these people were invested, I mean, to a lesser degree, the anarchists, but the moderate socialists, constitutional monarchists, liberals, they were invested in bourgeois capitalism. They wanted a continuation of the aristocracy, maybe without the Tsar, maybe with the Tsar. Maybe some of them were constitutional monarchists. They wanted the Tsar to have ceremonial power. These liberals probably wanted a full dictatorship of capital with like a prime minister that was fully answerable to finance capital and industrial capital. These people were not interested in empowering workers and peasants. They were interested in empowering capitalists to continue to oversee the affairs of the states. They were invested in the continued private ownership of land and means of production. They were invested in the continued oppression of workers and peasants. They were invested in the continued impoverishment of the countryside as a means of enriching the urban areas. These people were not interested in real change. They were interested in the illusion of incremental change that was really just things staying the same.
Liberals who sought rights and the rule of law. Lenin didn't believe
they didn't want the rule of law. They wanted the rule of capital. Lenin opposed the rule of capital. Lenin wanted workers and peasants to rule, not the interests of capital. He wanted the interests of labor to rule.
Revolution could proceed via peaceful change or negotiation with all these various leaders. Instead, he insisted on the use of violence against them and rejected peaceful change or negotiation. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks led a coup at a meeting of the Soviets, taking over government buildings, arms depots, transportation networks, and other infrastructure, and the party then endorsed elections to a constituent assembly that met in January 1918. The Bolsheviks won only a minority of the seats, but forced the dismissal of the assembly before it could be constituted as a...
So they endorsed the elections because there was no need. First of all, the elections had been organized in February as a result of that February revolution. The Bolsheviks didn't organize the election. There was no need for the Bolsheviks to oppose the election because the idea was that, like I said in the previous video, the idea was that Bolsheviks would participate in the election anyway, and they would use the election to espouse Bolshevik ideas, including that the parliament was not legitimate and Soviet power was legitimate. And if the Bolsheviks have complete control of the Soviets, what use do they still have for the Constituent Assembly, especially if that Constituent Assembly would just exist in parallel to the Soviets and keep on losing legitimacy, which it had been doing up until that point? And again, if the Bolsheviks had won, it's not like the Bolsheviks would have then magically, suddenly made the Constituent Assembly legit. They would have just used that power to dismantle the assembly because the idea was for all power to be in the Soviets, not the Constituent Assembly. So he says it like they're just this evil people who wanted elections to not happen. No, they wanted elections, but they wanted elections to the Soviets, and they wanted organs of power to be accountable to the Soviets, not to the Constituent Assembly. The way democracy in Soviet Russia worked was that people would elect their representative to their local Soviets. Local Soviets would elect representatives to the regional level Soviets, and then there would be a national level legislative body called the All Russia Congress of Soviets or something, and that would be the thing that later became the Supreme Soviet. At first, it was like the All Russia. Uh, let's just see, Supreme Soviet. Yeah, yeah. The Congress of Soviets was the original sort of the All Russian Congress of Soviets. This was the overall governing body, and it was a democratic body. Over Russia, there were hundreds of Soviets, democratic local governing bodies. And then Soviets elected delegates to the Congress of Soviets. And that Congress of Soviets held the national authority, making the highest decision. Of course, the Congress of Soviets was led by the Central Executive Committee, and obviously these would be elected by the Soviets. So it wasn't like a direct sort of democracy. People didn't vote for uh, Central Committee members of the Communist Party. These were people that would these people were elected by the Soviets, but the people elected the Soviets. So it's a similar like with how we see in China and in Cuba. Democracy is still democracy if you're electing people into democratic bodies. It not all democracy is just like a bourgeois election with like the red and green parties. Like the second All Russian Congress of Workers and Soldiers Deputy Soviets elected the second Central Executive Committee, and then this was the executive body of the RSFSR, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. Or I guess back then it was the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic until they changed all the names. But this Congress had 62 Bolsheviks, 29 left SRs, and 10 Mensheviks and right SRs. It wasn't even like a 1984, oh my god, there's no democracy, you can only vote for one party. No, there were 62 Bolsheviks out of 62 plus 29, that's 91. And then uh, 91 plus 10, that's 101, right? Yeah, yeah, 101 members, only 62 were Bolsheviks. That's hardly that. There's capitalist countries with bigger majorities than that. If we look at Singapore, hardly the most socialist place in the world. The legislature of Singapore is the parliament. The right wing party in Singapore, I guess you guys can see, the right wing party in Singapore has 79 members out of 103 seats. The first uh, executive committee of the Supreme Soviet of the All Russia Congress of Soviets had 62 Bolsheviks. Like I don't know, man. Yeah, I guess 62 plus 10, 72, and then 72 plus 29. That would be yeah, 1 1. I don't know, I was getting the formation wrong. But yeah, it wasn't like, oh, Lenin hated democracy. No, there was just a parallel system of democracy that was already going on that the Duma, the Constituent Assembly, was not necessary. It's not like Lenin didn't believe in democracy. No, there was just another democracy.
government. The Bolsheviks then developed a tactic meant to destroy, in the words of one, constitutional illusions. They imprisoned and murdered advocates for democracy and constitutions and freedom of.
Oh, they, they imprison and murders advocates for democracy and constitutions and freedom of political expression. That's not what they did. They imprisoned and murdered people who were not interested in preserving Soviet power because they're interested in overthrowing Soviet power because they're interested in the preservation of capitalist Tsarist authority, not Soviet authority. Of course, those people were existential enemies and they would have done the same to Bolsheviks if they were successful, but they weren't because Bolsheviks had the will of the people behind them. Good grief.
Political expression by the tens and eventually the hundreds of thousands. And as they took control, the Bolsheviks shuttered local institutions such as the Zemstvas. They nationalized industries and banks, and by late 1917 began seeking a negotiated withdrawal from the war. The Germans offered.
He says it like, oh, they shut down all that other stuff. Yes, because that other stuff was against them. That other stuff didn't believe in the Soviets. The people believe in the Soviets. The people were marching under peace, land, and bread. He just acknowledged in the second half of this video, in the first half of this video, that those slogans were popular. People did want peace, land, and bread. So of course they took steps to secure that.
Only the draconian Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which gave Russia's western holdings to Germany. Lenin initially called the German offer obscene, but as the Central Powers continued their advance through Russian territory, he finally accepted the treaty. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So by this time, the Russian capital had been moved from Petrograd/St. Petersburg to Moscow because Germany.
And yeah, I mean, Lenin would have called the German offer obscene, but he was still invested in peace. Like every Bolshevik wanted peace. The only Bolsheviks who didn't want peace were people who, like I said in the previous video, were scared of the international revolution failing and they wanted to use the Red Army to attack Western Europe and forcefully trigger socialist revolutions throughout Western Europe. They were invested in that. They didn't believe that, and of course, this isn't to say that these people were like wrong to think this, like morally wrong, because these people were also communists, but they thought that as communists, a communist country can't make a peace treaty with an imperialist power. They didn't believe that was possible. People like Lenin and Stalin had to accept that for one reason or another, nationalism is a superior sentiment to working class and proletarian class solidarity. The expectation was that the proletariats of those countries would support the Russian proletariat and the Soviet Ukrainian proletariat and Soviet Belarusian proletariat and help them to trigger revolutions in their countries. But Stalin was one of the only people that said this, that nationalism is a very powerful sentiment. And we can't expect that we can just march the Red Army into Poland and Polish people would watch themselves be, conquered by Russians. And it would just be sunshine and rainbows. And they did try and fight a war against Poland. And they lost that war because nationalism is very powerful. This was why Stalin began advocating for socialism in one country, because it had become clear that there was not going to be like a worldwide revolution, especially in Western Europe, because, like I said in the previous video, at the time, there was a lot of thinking that Russia wouldn't be the first socialist country, that it might be Germany or France or another more advanced sort of industrialized country. No one expected it to be Russia or China or Vietnam or Laos. They thought that it would be France or Germany, that those would be the types of countries that would become socialist. That was the dominant thinking of the time. But the situation changed and they had to learn that, okay, there isn't going to be a worldwide revolution. What do we do now? Do we give up? Of course not. We can't give up. So let's build socialism in one country and use that as a stepping stone, as an example for other countries to see. Let's give ourselves universal healthcare and universal education and build up our industry without exploiting colonial powers. And let's show the world that it's possible, so that one by one, other countries can decide we want to be like the Soviet Union. And we will help them if it comes to that. But we can't skip the cutscene. That was what Stalin thought. That was, at the time, they called it the right opposition. And the right opposition was sort of seen as like, they were seen as revisionists and reactionaries for thinking that you could build socialism in one country and not supporting international revolution, which was like Trotsky's big thing, or Trotsky's claim that it's his big thing anyway. I don't know that Trotsky necessarily had a big thing and wasn't just like generally opposed to, or generally was in favor of whatever Stalin opposed and vice versa. But yeah, that's the context for all of this. There were people in the there were people among communists. Communists weren't in agreement on what should be done. There was always debate, and that's why the propaganda of like, oh, Lenin's dictatorship, there's one party, there's no debates. So one party says, but like, no, even within the party, there's a lot of debate, and there was still no consensus. And sometimes things that ended up being correct weren't popular, but they just had to do those things because that's just what the situation demanded.
Troops had gotten too close. Lenin believed that an imminent uprising of Europe's entire working class would overturn the whole Brest-Litovsk settlement anyway and restore Russia's original boundaries, but he ultimately rejected his initial faith in worldwide revolution, settling instead for socialism in one country. That said, the Bolsheviks did want to promote and control the rise of communist parties elsewhere, so they established the Communist International, or Comintern, in 1919. Brest-Litovsk was a turning point for many, including those who were ready to continue fighting for a Russian victory in World War I. Dissident generals received volunteers from an array of those who feared the rise of the Bolsheviks, from monarchists and liberals to other kinds of socialists. And we're emphasizing the diversity of beliefs here to show that Bolshevism was just one of many responses, some radical, some moderate, to the dysfunction and deprivation of early 20th century Russia. But at any rate, these diverse non-Bolshevik groups were united primarily by their dislike of the Bolsheviks, who by this time had rejected the word socialist in favor of a new party name, communist.
That's not really true. I don't know why he says that, but that's literally not true. The reason the Bolsheviks changed their name to the Russian Communist Party was because they felt like the dominant strain of, they used to be called the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. The reason that they changed their name was because they felt that Social Democrats had abandoned communism. They, for one reason or another, they had become too afraid of what communism actually meant. They were too unwilling, they were too dogmatic, they were too concessionary. There were multiple reasons, but the Communist Party of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and originally the Russian Communist Party, they changed their name from social democracy to communism. To communist, like the social democracy, what we know today as social democracy usually refers to capitalism with like an expansive welfare state. But until like the 1920s, until basically until 1919, what we understand as socialism was social democracy. If you read like early Lenin, if you read early Stalin, if you read all of these guys, they have a lot of like mentions of social democracy, and they're talking about socialism. If you read Marxism and the National Question, there are a lot of times where Stalin refers to social democracy. He refers to social democracy as he refers to social democracy. Yeah, he refers to social democracy, but not all social democrats proved equal to the task. Like, this is something that yeah, he's talking about like the Russian social democrats. Why the social democrats in Austria, the Russian social democrats, the Austrian social democrats, the Ruthenian social democrats. When have social democrats begun? What sort of social democrats? Austrian social democrats. He means socialists. They changed their name. They changed their name to the Russian Communist Party from the Russian Social Democratic and Labour Party because they were a minority among social democracy. Not everyone that identified under the umbrella of social democracy, which was understood to mean the parties who were interested in building a society that would progress to communism, agreed with their ideas. So they changed their name to um to the Communist Party. They didn't abandon the label of socialist and become communist. French Bolshevik has a video I'll link in the description on why exactly they changed their name, and it has to do with like the speech that Lenin gave at Comintern in 1919, and also the book he wrote about left-wing communism. Inside that book, he talks about these things as well. In this book, he he speaks about these things and why the Communist Party changed their name. They didn't abandon socialism for communism. That's just completely untrue. I'm surprised that he would just say something That's not true. Like up until now, this video has been like somewhat factual, but I'm shocked that he just said something that just isn't true.
Felt that the socialists in Russia and elsewhere were just too reform-minded and compromise-oriented and pro-democracy. And so eventually civil war broke out, and until
Pro-democracy. That's such a man. They weren't too pro-democracy for Lenin. They were too invested in bourgeois institutions and not invested enough in proletarian institutions like the Soviets.
1922, Russia and a good part of Eastern Europe were racked with violence and disease and famine and starvation. The Bolshevik dictatorship and its Red Terror battled the so-called White Movement, which even in its name defined itself primarily by its opposition to the Bolshevik Reds.
The Bolshevik dictatorship and its Red Terror. Again, we just learned in the previous video, why did the Red Terror happen? The Red Terror happened because people that opposed Bolshevism, as John Green claims, these people were trying to do things like kill Lenin. They were doing assassination attempts. They were sabotaging Bolshevik institutions like the Soviets. They didn't agree with the revolution. They were counter-revolutionary. That was why the Red Terror happened. You can agree or disagree. You can think that you know, why couldn't they just peacefully resolve these things? That's all fine. But like, we can't just pretend that like the Bolsheviks were the comic book villains.
Meanwhile, in areas like Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Central Asia, people were seeking independence from Russia, although in many places.
So the thing with people seeking independence from Russia is that all of those places were already independent. If you look at the Russian Civil War, and if you actually look at the main belligerency, if you actually study this, let me try and I don't know how whether we can zoom. Let's actually study this. Let me not zoom in too big. Let's study this. These are the main belligerents of the Russian Civil War. We can see that there's many different parties. There is the Bolsheviks, there is the White Movement, which is the Russian Republic, there are national separatists, there are the Central Powers, who are just like World War One, basically. These guys are still invested in winning World War One. They are the Allies. These guys are also still invested in World War One. They also want to win World War One. They don't really care about what's happening in Russia. And then there's the anti-Bolshevik left, who are the left SRs. And the thing with the left SRs is that the left SRs, technically speaking, the left SRs were like the socialist revolutionaries who initially agreed with like the Soviets and the Bolshevik power and everything, but a few of them didn't want the war to end. But the thing is, of those left SRs, the best, most radical SRs still joined the Bolsheviks, but the rest of them then, joined the rest of the anti-Bolshevik forces. And obviously that means some SRs obviously supported Bolsheviks. But the main point is that if we look here, we can see that like the Bolsheviks include Soviet Russia, Soviet Ukraine, Soviet Belarus, the Transcaucasian SFSR. That's basically like Armenian SSR, Soviet Moldova, and the Red Finland, Bessarabian SSR. Like all of these places were independent, and then national separatists in Poland, national separatists in Finland, national separatists in Ukraine, national separatists in Belarus. All of these places had right-wing governments. They opposed the Russian Empire, and by extension, they also opposed the Soviet Union. But these places were still independent. The USSR wasn't created until 1922, when Soviet Russia, Soviet Ukraine, Soviet Belarus, Soviet Transcaucasus, all the Central Asian, Soviet Kazakhstan, Soviet Kyrgyzstan, Soviet Uzbekistan, Soviet Turkmenistan, all those places agreed to unite into one country. I guess the Central Asian ones came later when they were created from Soviet Russia. But the point is that federally, those places already had Bolshevik institutions. They were already in power. So this idea that like, independence movements, those places were already independent. Russia was one country, Ukraine was one country, Belarus was one country. The Transcaucasian SFSR was one entity, political entity with power. These entities then agreed to unite into one supranational, supranational. It was a federal union of 15 national republics. So the idea that those places wanted independence is not really true. I mean, it's true, but it's not really reflective of what was happening on the ground. Russia wasn't technically Soviet Russia did not have any sort of territorial claim on those places. I mean, some Russians might have thought that they still own those places, but the reality was that Soviet Russia didn't. It was later on that they would choose to incorporate those places into their territory. You can disagree or agree on what the reasons were for that, but like that's what happened.
The independence movements were themselves also divided by beliefs around the role the state should play in the lives of its citizens, whether democracy was compatible with a strong state, and whether businesses should be government-held or privately run. The Bolsheviks took advantage of these divisions both by taking on factions individually and by pitting them against each other.
Yeah, the Bolsheviks took advantage of those divisions because that's what happens when when reactionary forces are united. When there's a left-wing force that is ideologically disciplined and has mass appeal, any reactionary coalition who is only united by just hating communism and hating socialism, but doesn't have any ideas, any concrete ideas of their own that can mobilize a working base, of course they're going to lose, especially when those ideas are most popular in industrialized areas with high populations, and the reactionary forces are popular in rural areas with low populations and no industry.
As Trotsky simultaneously built a loyal Red Army, and as the newly created Cheka, or secret
Trotsky's Red Army, I would say that is not likely that I don't agree with characterizing them as loyal, because like we just established in the last video, Trotsky literally filled the Red Army with czarist soldiers. He replaced the traditional election. He abolished workers' control over the Red Army, and he replaced it by personally handpicking imperial czarists by holding their families hostage. And by 1922, ex-czarists were 83% of the officers in the Red Army. So maybe they're loyal to Trotsky, but I don't know if they were committed socialists and principled Marxists the way the original Red Guards had been. The Red Guards that the Red Army was reorganized into. And obviously the Cheka was the, extraordinary committee that had to respond to all the fucking threats of sabotage from counter-revolutionary forces.
police picked off opponents, the whites were eventually defeated. Not only was the white movement disunited in its goals, they also lacked a brilliantly brutal leader like Lenin, or an organization.
A brilliantly brutal leader. Dude. Lenin was a guy who wore a suit and just talked really loud. If anybody was brilliantly brutal, it was the white movement, who this guy just admitted used to carry out pogroms of Jews in their divisions. They were more interested in finding out who the Jewish soldiers were than having a plan or an ideology. Lenin was not a soldier. Lenin never had a military rank. Lenin was a writer and a student and a thinker. He wasn't someone that was brutal. He didn't assassinate anybody. If anybody did those things, it was Stalin, but it was not Lenin.
Organizational talent like Trotsky. The communist society the Bolsheviks established was far different from the one envisioned by the Marxist socialists of the 19th century. It was to be led by an elite, according to Lenin's plan, not.
It wasn't to be led by an elite. It was, again, like we just established, it was to be led by a Congress of Soviets that were elected from the local Soviets, all democratic local governing bodies where everyone could participate. And Soviets elected delegates to the Congress, and then the Congress themselves would elect the executive committee, who were then, the executive body, and then they would then be obviously led by the central committee of the of the Communist Party. Yeah. So I don't know what he means by led by an elite. If I mean, it's just such a strange framing because it makes it seem like, oh, Lenin just wanted his friends to rule Russia, but like no, it's It's a democratic body. It's these things were all government agencies. It wasn't like a strange thing. The Council of People's Commissars were the 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 ministries of like they answered to the Congress of Soviets. It wasn't like a strange, confusing thing. I don't know why he's so committed to this idea that like Lenin just wanted his friends to rule. Like no, it's democracy, man. It's just another way. It's still democratic.
by workers. In fact, the Bolsheviks crushed a grain opposition from peasants who were angry about the army confiscating their grain.
So the thing with the Green Army is that in the last video we talked about how the Tsarists had introduced in the last video we talked about how the Tsarists had introduced basically private farming, and they were basically they were they were not class allies to the workers and peasants because they opposed the Bolsheviks. They opposed collectivization. They opposed basically anything that would collectivize agriculture, and they didn't really have much support. The primary base of the peasantry was did not want to wage war in the Russian Civil War. The the Green Armies were people like Nestor Makhno who were just interested in like anarchism, and they didn't really care about anything that the Soviet Russia, Soviet Belarus, Soviet Ukraine were trying to do. It was not like, oh, the peasants actually hated. No, the peasants were the people who were marching for for peace, land, and bread. The peasants were the people who were supporting the Soviets because the Soviets wanted to enact land reforms and you know, allow people to take vacations and stuff. Like this is not some weird thing of like, oh, the Bolsheviks betrayed the peasants. Like this is, yeah, it's not really true.
Which the Bolsheviks justified as necessary for, quote, war communism. The Bolsheviks
Again, he says war communism to make it sound scary and stuff. But in the last video, we still talked about how war communism was just like a reaction to the Civil War. This is not communism. Uh, all of this stuff, some of it is communism, but like it has a specific context. Like obviously, nationalization of all industries is socialism. State control of foreign trade is socialism. Strict discipline for workers, you can, yeah, I don't know. Requisition of grain, it's not really socialism. It's like a wartime measure. Food rationing isn't socialism. It's a wartime measure. Okay, yeah, private enterprise being banned. It that is socialism, I guess. Military control of the railways. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, technically, you would want civilian control under like state power. And yeah, again, it has long been debated whether war communism represented an actual economic policy or merely a set of measures intended to win civil war. Yeah, it was clearly just a reaction to the civil war. It's not some kind of like thing. It's just they were being attacked and wanted to defend themselves.
also executed sailors in Kronstadt who objected.
They did not execute sailors in Kronstadt. They executed the again. I will link to Finnish Bolshevik video on the Kronstadt rebellion, but they executed to white generals and dissidents who tried to take advantage of confusion and lie to the people about what was happening. Once the people of Kronstadt realized what was happening, the rebellion ended. This is not some strange, it's not some heroic rebellion against Bolshevik power. It was a fake staged rebellion. It wasn't real.
To the growing privileges of the Bolshevik elite. But instead of the state withering away after a workers' revolution, as Marx had predicted, the Bolshevik state became ever more powerful, albeit
It became ever more powerful because external forces tried to destroy it externally and they had to defend themselves. The withering away of the state was supposed to. The withering away of the state refers to a communist society where relations of production are no longer needed and institutions like the government itself is no longer needed and it becomes obsolete over time. It doesn't mean that a communist society immediately dissolves its army and dissolves its government and just lets people just walk around. And then if a sovereign country invades it, then it has no means of defending itself. That's a very that is not what that's not what Marx thought. Also, Marx lived like 80 years before any of this happened. So he could not have foreseen that, first of all, that the first successful socialist revolution would be in Russia, and that there would also be a world war happening at the same time. Marx couldn't have seen that. We can't just say, oh, Marx thought that the states would wither away. First of all, Engels thought that, not Marx. But like, you can't just say, oh, the state didn't wither away. Therefore, like, this is, yeah, I don't know.
With the support of many in the population. Beginning with Lenin, it inflicted perpetual violence on its own people, inventing
It did not inflict perpetual violence on its own people. It inflicted perpetual violence on its enemies, the people that were trying to destroy it. Workers and peasants were not the enemies of the Bolsheviks. This is very obfuscatory language meant to confuse the viewer. They did not inflict violence on just anyone. It wasn't just random. They targeted people that were their enemies. You can agree or disagree, but like that's what happened.
Constant threats from civilian enemies. Lenin believed such violence was key not just to establishing a Bolshevik state, but also to maintaining one.
Yeah, to maintaining one because it was under constant threat of destruction from the Allies, from all of these people. All these people wanted to destroy the Soviet power. So they were invested in protecting it. That's how this works. That is how this works.
1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was declared. Up and coming.
The Union of Socialist Soviet Republics was declared. They wouldn't change the name until 1936 with Stalin's constitution. When it was created, it was the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, not Soviet Socialist Republics.
Bolshevik activist Joseph Stalin helped forge the federation from the ethnic groups of the former Russian Empire. The USSR supposedly fulfilled a Bolshevik promise to more than 100 ethnicities of the old.
I love how he adds a note that this photo is not fake. Like he has to acknowledge that, like, yes, Lenin and Stalin were actually friends. Like the idea that like they didn't like each other is not true. They were actually friends.
Old Russian Empire, that they might retain their culture and language and other local ways, but to say that those promises were not kept would be something of an understatement. Big challenges loomed for the Bolsheviks even after these triumphs. Industrial production had fallen to 13% of its pre-war level. The death toll of the Civil War and the accompanying disease and famine is estimated at 10 million. Still, the post-war Bolshevik propaganda machine thrived, drawing in people enthusiastic about the idea of a workers' paradise.
Oh my god. Still it thrived. No shit it thrived. They had just successfully defended a revolution that threatened to destroy everything that they had worked for since 1905. Not only were they the first successful socialist revolution, they were the first revolution to defend themselves from imperials. Of course they fucking became more popular. And of course they eventually they immediately began steps to build their new society. Like why does he say it like it's magic? That like we did a revolution against the imperialists and the imperialists tried to stop it and we beat the imperialists again.
And in some cases, real progress was made. The strapped government set up health clinics and daycare centers so that everyone could work to revive the economy. The daughter of an imperial general, Alexandra Kollontai, oversaw the welfare.
The daughter of an imperial general, he says that like she's some sort of like bad person when she's one of like the best, the most iconic, important Bolshevik thinkers who had like such radical ideas even for the time. Kollontai was saying things like the nuclear family should be abolished, that there should be communal raising of children, that property rights should be abolished, inheritance should be abolished, that everyone has a responsibility to the children of um of everyone, not just like my nuclear family, my mother and father. She was behind the most radical ideas. Obviously, they had to be rolled back because they weren't like society as a whole wasn't ready for them. Because the thing is that the reason why the 1936 Constitution rolled back a lot of her radical ideas was because the 1936 Constitution had a lot of inputs from ordinary people. Stalin's government went around asking people, "What do you want to be in the next constitution?" And they said what they wanted. And at the time, the USSR was doing a lot of radical things like allowing abortions and outlawing property rights and heavily restricting religious expression. And those things were gradually rolled back because the USSR wanted to be, less less draconian and less accelerationist with its social progress. And obviously that had trade-offs. You can agree or disagree, but like I think it's very admirable. And the fact that like he just says the daughter of an imperial general, like she's some sort of like twisted, like no. Most people don't know about her because that's just how history happened. Like Elena Sasova, Kollontai, most people don't really know about them. Even Lenin's wife, Nadia Krupskaya, was a full Bolshevik in her own right and did lots of things too. Obviously, she did some not so nice things when it came to faking Lenin's testaments, but Yeah, I don't know why he frames it like it's some bad thing.
System and wrote easy-to-read novels about the wholesome relationships between men and women under communism. Communist enthusiasts taught rural people to read and proselytized to make Muslim
They taught the evil communists taught raw people how to read by advocating for mass literacy and building 20,000 schools. The evil communists, they built the evil communists. What did the evil communists do? Look at the evil communists. They put they put 23,000 students in school. They put 23 million students in school after the first 5-year plan. They built 17. They put 17 million students in elementary schools. They built 40,000 public libraries. They had 86 million books in public libraries. They had 587 theaters. They had 27,000 cinemas. They had 500 cinemas with sound. They had 4 billion. They had 4,000. Is this 4 million? They had 4 million newspapers in circulation. This is the evil communists teaching poor people how to read in the rural districts. In the rural districts, they had 17,000 cinemas in rural districts. 40,000 public libraries. And all those things would increase after the second 5-year plan, but just in the first 5-year plan, these are the evil communists teaching people how to read.
communities adopt what
Proletizing. What does he say?
between men and women under communism. Communist enthusiasts taught rural people to read and proselytized to make Muslim communities adopt what Bolsheviks interpreted as modern ways.
They made what he's talking about is the Hujum in Central Asia, where the women of Central Asia asked the women in Uzbekistan, I think, the women in the Central Asian SSRs asked the Bolsheviks to help them overthrow the most backwards, gender inequalities there. They wanted the rights to choose, and they wanted the rights to stop being forced to marry as children and stuff. That's what he's talking about, modernizing as like it being bad. All those people in Uzbekistan still have their cultures today. They weren't destroyed. Soviets didn't just destroy. They didn't just is destroy Uzbek culture. It's still a thing. What they went in there and they stopped the things that they wanted them to solve. Obviously, some of them made some Bolsheviks made mistakes in this aspect. Kollontai used them in a very exploitative way. She sort of like dramatized them, like tearing off their veils or some dramatic thing. That can be critiqued, but like we can't just say, oh, the Bolsheviks went in there and they started messing with the peaceful Muslim cultures, or like the sort of like the strict veiling. And again, women wanted the choice. Women wanted to they wanted the choice. Lady Izdihar has a very good video on this on this topic. I can link it in the description. But it wasn't just something of like, oh, Bolsheviks were preaching to Muslims and were against their culture. Like, no, it was very nuanced.
A reminder that not all missionaries are religious. Pioneering filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein produced
Yeah, man, not all missionaries are religious. Like, dude, come on.
classic celebrations of ordinary people, such as Battleship Potemkin, which is about a group of sailors rebelling against Tsarist brutality. But it's inaccurate to imagine the Bolshevik Revolution led to some immediate and total communism. In fact, in 1921, Lenin declared the new economic policy, in which elements of capitalism, such as individual businesses, would be allowed to help boost
He did that as a strategic retreat, as we said in the last video, as a strategic retreat from socialism, because the war had destroyed the economy to a degree that would not have been the case if they had been allowed to peacefully develop after 1917. But they were not. A war was forced to destroy them, and they survived, so they had to start from somewhere, which meant giving concessions to capitalism, concessions that would be rolled back. And in fact, at the time, not all communists agreed with what Lenin wanted to do. There was a left opposition that did not want the new economic policy because they felt that it would be a return to capitalism. And they were correct, because Stalin, despite opposing the NEP, would later come to embody the left opposition by initiating the collectivization of agriculture and everything else that he did. So it wasn't some strange thing. Socialism is a process. Every country is different. And especially for the first country to do it, there will be mistakes and they will learn from them and they will make it up as they go along because that was their only option.
Productivity. Communist entrepreneurs were encouraged to grow rich and wealth became valued. So-called NEP men flourished, as did women dripping in jewels and furs. It was one more compromise the Bolsheviks made as a temporary means to the end of domination. Beginning in 1922, Lenin suffered a series of strokes that eventually killed him in January 1924. Joseph Stalin organized and led a lavish funeral, handing out minor roles to other Bolsheviks and sidelining his rival Trotsky, who would go on to be murdered.
He did not sideline his rival Trotsky. Trotsky, as early as 1922, has already started losing influence. We looked at the triumvirates earlier in the last video. The triumvirate of the Soviet Union was Stalin, Kamenev, and Zinoviev, not Trotsky. These guys were when Lenin was still alive. Trotsky would not be part of this because Trotsky was already making a left opposition. He was already opposing Lenin when Lenin was still alive. It was after Lenin died that Trotsky started writing propaganda about how he was actually Lenin's best friend and Lenin secretly hated Stalin. This is not history. Trotsky was primarily Lenin's rival, not even. Of course, he was Stalin's rival, but like even as early as even when Lenin was alive, Trotsky had already started losing influence. There was a triumvirate consisting of Stalin, who was the general secretary, Kamenev and Zinoviev, who were still top guys, but not Lenin's top guy because Lenin made Stalin general secretary in 1922 for a reason. He didn't make Kamenev or Zinoviev. And Kamenev was Stalin's friend because even when they came up with the fake Lenin's testament and Zinoviev brought to Kamenev, Kamenev nixed the idea and decided that they weren't going to do it because, again, Kamenev had known Stalin for 20 years, like Kotkin says in the video that I linked in the last video. It was not some strange thing. It wasn't magic that Stalin became the most powerful person, the number two guy. Lenin never intended to step aside, but he died. But Lenin had made Stalin the number two guy. That's just how the history happened. Trotsky was not in that narrative because Lenin was already frustrated with Trotsky by that point.
Via ice axe to the face at Stalin's order. We'll get to that and much more when Crash Course returns to Soviet Russia in 2 weeks. Thanks for watching. I'll see you then. Thanks so much for watching Crash Course, which is filmed here in the Jaden Smith's.
Yeah, overall, not too bad a video, but still a lot of. Again, these videos when they're talking about the actual history, they're not too bad. But when they actually start talking about the actual socialism, that's when they become unbearable. So at least this one was shorter. It was very funny.